today is Bruce Gilley. He is a professor of political science and public policy at Portland State University. His work centers on global politics, democracy, comparative development, and colonial history. And his very provocative and prescient book, The Case for Colonialism, is available certainly at Amazon and elsewhere. Bruce, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Bruce, your book, as I say, is quite prescient in light of a very recent development that seems to be rolling across the firmament in American culture and around the world. And that is this idea that there is some kind of a value to indigenous status. The idea that if you can trace your ancestry back to a certain date, that date not being determined, this somehow gives you some sort of a virtue or some kind of a legitimacy in terms of claiming land and claiming certain benefits. So talk on that a bit, and then we can talk about the history of what you describe as colonialism, what I would describe as immigration. But let's start there.
Yeah, well, the right of conquest, indeed the expectation of conquest, was the norm in all of human societies until very, very recently. Maybe the 17th century in Europe, and certainly not before the 19th century outside of Europe. It was assumed that stronger groups would expand, groups with better economic systems, better political systems, and would expand into places with either no economic or political system to speak of, or one that was less attractive or less successful. And so when Europeans went into places and engaged in conquest, they were doing exactly what indigenous peoples expected them to do. This is the great irony of saying that colonialism somehow violated norms. Colonialism was the most culturally sensitive act in human history because expanding into other areas was exactly what all indigenous groups did. The South Pacific Islanders who were colonized by the Germans and the Dutch and the French and the British, they spent all of their time conquering rival islands and subjugating and exterminating them. The indigenous peoples were engaged in nothing but intertribal warfare and conquest and expansion throughout the pre-European contact period. That was certainly the case in Africa, all of whose contemporary peoples today are in places where their ancestors conquered. All of Southern Africa, the blacks who claim, the right to be free from the white man in Southern Africa are all Bantu migrants who exterminated most of what are the Khoisan people, the what's left of the indigenous peoples of Southern Africa, are all living on land that was stolen from them, if you want to use that term, by the Bantu expansion, the Bugandan expansion of Uganda, the Fulani expansion of West Africa. So if you want to say that European colonialism violated some norm, you're going to have a hard time finding any evidence of that norm prior to the European expansion itself. And this is where the indigenous peoples will say, well, our knowledge keepers tell us that before the white man, it was community barbecues and we sat staring at the sky and spending our time with our families. Of course, the reason they appeal to indigenous knowledge is because they know darn well that if we actually use archaeological and anthropological evidence, which you can see if you go to your local museum and look at the war blankets they made, showing themselves engaged in battles with other tribes, that actually settlement and expansion and migration has always been the norm in human societies. And the first people to say, maybe we should have some rules about this, maybe we should agree to spheres of influence, maybe we should sign treaties, create laws, demarcate boundaries. The first people to do that were the Europeans. So then appealing to those European ideas of boundaries and laws and treaties and expectations and what's rightfully yours and what you have a claim to is to appeal to a European norm that didn't exist in your culture. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say, I don't want the Europeans, but I do want suddenly to appeal to all their norms and systems to get back something that I lost because of norms that were normal in my community.
Right, and you mentioned the phenomena of the South Pacific Islands and how they were at war with each other before Europeans entered the picture. I think I would note that my understanding is that, for example, New Zealand actually was simultaneously settled by the British and by the Maori people who had been island people. Before that, the island was virtually empty. So you could say, if you're going to argue for indigenous status, both peoples are indigenous to those islands. But of course, in the Americas, likewise, you had wars that were fairly constant between the native tribes, and that there were certain tribes that were dominant and were very oppressive to the tribes that they defeated. They include the Sioux, the Comanche, the Apache. And then in Central America, the Aztecs, who were so fierce and so violent toward the people that they were oppressing in that region, that when Cortez landed on the shores of Mexico and burned his boats so that they would not be able to return, they were welcomed with open arms as they approached Teotihuacan, which is today's Mexico City. And they also took wives amongst the natives to develop this sort of this new race, I guess you could say. This, they call it the solar race, which is mestizo. And so, in a sense, you could say that that status, in certainly in Mexico and in much of Latin America, is European and native. It's not that well demarked. But you also note that it was the Western European uh, philosophy, culture that gave birth to this idea of developing treaties of peace between nations. And in the United States, that was expressed by Washington as he was leaving office in his famous farewell address, where he said that the United States would not be engaged in foreign entanglements, that we were going to disengage from these sorts of wars, that we would be neutral, that we would hold out a branch of peace to all nations, but we would not interfere in their internal affairs. And that was expanded by John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State to Monroe, who developed the Monroe Doctrine, which said that the Western Hemisphere would be sort of our area of interest, and that no foreign power could come in and intervene in the sovereignty of the Americas. And the whole idea was the promotion of and the advancement of national sovereignty. That was a very American idea. I think it's the American contribution to world geopolitical thought.
Yes, certainly, the assertion of national sovereignty in the Americas was very much like the Treaty of Westphalia, which asserted the national sovereignty of Europe. So the United States was taking and extending this idea of nation states, self-governing nation states, because by then, with the Industrial Revolution, it was clear that fixed boundaries were critical to national flourishing and human flourishing, because suddenly there was a huge premium on social cooperation. If you wanted to gain the benefits of the Industrial Revolution and of capitalism, you needed systems in which you had such a specialization of labor that the only way to unlock those benefits was there to be fixed borders, so that you shared in the taxes and the spending, the public infrastructure, the public taxation, to create this specialized economy, which was dynamite in terms of creating wealth and human well-being. The boundaries were really critical to that, and that's part of what people forget is that, yes, self-government was intended to unlock kind of what we see as a kind of emancipatory idea of the individual, having some control over the political power that affects them. That's fine. But self-government was also had a very economic logic to it, which is that self-governing territories would do better economically than territories that were just subject to the whims of global markets and profiteers and claim stakers. You needed those boundaries. But I would say, European colonialism from the start talked about self-government. You go back to the time of the Indian Mutiny in 1857. When essentially British replaced the East India Company with what became the Raj, and they said very early on, we're here to develop the self-governing capacity of the Indian people. That's a long project. We need education, we need training, we need to develop a bureaucracy, we need to make sure that we have a police force that can maintain the peace. But nonetheless, that's the end point. And I think across the colonies, the European colonies, that was always seen as the end point, to transfer to self-governance. Now, the debates on the timing of that and the mode of that always led to a certain amount of friction. Sometimes that friction could spill over into armed conflict. But this was a debate on timing and sequencing and methods of self-government. It was never the case, even in the French colonies, which believed that they would always be part of France, but self-governing parts of France, right? In other words,
Right. Mm-hmm.
with internal self-government, and that was never in doubt. So, the European contribution was not just to create rules about sovereignty and about boundaries and about the right not to be conquered. There was a distinctive European contribution, but also to then layer on top of that this idea of self-government within that boundary as being, the purpose of the colonial mission.
Right, and I think it even goes back to the ancient Greeks, where the word colony comes from the Greek colonia, where the Greek city-states started to set up new trading colonies across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and some of those became fantastic independent nations and major city-states. It wasn't so much to control them, but it was to advance the culture of the time for the mutual benefit of all sides. I'm not saying it's all altruistic, but it was sort of a spread of Greek philosophy, Greek knowledge, Greek civilization around the world. And that you mentioned of course, the European colonial experiment, starting with the Spanish and the Portuguese. For better or worse, it brought modern Western ideas and governance and technologies and economies to parts of the world that were not as advanced. It is that simple. You mentioned India. In the British, for better or worse, and I'm not saying their record's so, by any means pristine over there, but nevertheless, they united the country with one language, one religion, one railroad system, one currency, one form of government, and they really gave the creation of a united India, whereas before it was a multiple squabbling states that were often at war with each other, or were dominated by this dictatorship that was the Mughal Empire, which had gone into decline, and it was a subcontinent that was filled with conflict. So they really didn't do the same thing, I think, in Africa, where they probably could have, only because there were rivalries between the British and the French, and then later the Dutch and the Belgians and the Germans got through their hat in the ring at one point. But nevertheless, you have the emergence of modern sovereign states in Africa that today are becoming powerhouses. So, there was a great cross-pollination of culture around the world as a result of that colonial enterprise, which was primarily 18th to 19th centuries.
Yeah, and you say it wasn't altruistic, and my response is, well, thank God it wasn't altruistic,
Mm-hmm.
because altruism is a really bad way to organize human endeavor. I
Right.
mean, yeah, you may get some people raising money at Christmas for the Salvation Army, but that's not the way to bring people out of poverty. If it had been altruistic, it wouldn't have happened. And even if it had happened under some kind of altruistic, foreign missionary society, it wouldn't have been even the 1 millionth successful or as effective. I mean, humans need to eat and work and be productive, and the colonial endeavor required productive endeavors in order to draw into these places the capital and the manpower and the training. If there was no profit to be had, why on earth would they be there? And how could they ever have built these railways and these education systems and these systems of government, and sent these colonial officers into these hinterlands to run legal courts and offer education, especially to women and to historically, oppressed minority groups in particular. I mean, thank God it wasn't altruistic, and thank God it was exploitative. It's like Joan Robinson, the famous British economist, who says like the only thing worse than being exploited by the capitalists is not being exploited by the capitalists.
Right,
Um,
right.
and
And I
so
suppose
when
if you
people,
want to talk about an altruistic colonial movement, you could look at communism or Nazism or today's radical Islam. They're marching in a utopian goose step to try to create this world order that basically is stripping people of basic rights and instituting a sort of a neo-slavery type modality. And by the way, speaking of which, it was, I suppose, colonialism, if you will, or conquest out of the Arabian Peninsula that created the Islamic world. Those were Christian countries, Syria, Palestine, Turkey, Egypt, North Africa, that was subdued by Arab forces and it was done in a very unpleasant way. So, they talk about indigenous rights. I mean, I suppose the best manifestation of that right now is the Israeli-Arab conflict. That somehow the Jews don't have indigenous rights to Palestine. Which, by the way, if we're going to talk indigenous, I would argue they do. They should issue a land statement, like the kind that's tacked up to my local college here in Boston. But putting that aside, because again, that's not, it's really not a whole part of a claim to legitimate sovereignty. The region was conquered by the Arabians. That's why they call them Arabs. They're Arabian. They came out of that area and they conquered all of these countries and basically subdued the native peoples and the native religions. So,
it's funny
yeah.
because they called it the Sword of Islam, right? The Sword of Islam was their equivalent of the Mission Civilisatrice, which was the European colonial motivation, which is the civilizing mission. For the Arabs, it was the Sword of Islam was the mission at stake. It was to spread Islam, and that's fine. That was a religious revival. Um, but it's interesting when you look at probably one of the most misunderstood colonial conflicts of the 20th century, which was Mussolini's march into Abyssinia
Mhm.
and conquest of Abyssinia, what's today Ethiopia. And people say, well, this just shows that fascism and colonialism were part of the same thing. Well, no, because what the fascists did under Mussolini was exactly what the Arabs had done 1,000 years earlier, which is essentially conquer in the name of Islam. Abyssinia was a Christian state before
Mhm.
before the Italian invasion.
Right.
And what Mussolini promised was to rid the place of Christians, to impose Sharia law, and to extend the power of Islam. That's why the Egyptians and the Saudis supported Mussolini's march into Abyssinia, because they saw this as the Arab and Islamic world reclaiming its rightful place over this ancient kingdom, which had been unfortunately in the hands of the Christians for so many centuries. And so what Mussolini was doing was essentially replicating not European colonialism, but Arab colonialism. And he styled himself the liberator of the Arabs. All of his speeches were about how he is stepping into the shoes of the great Arab conquerors of history. And so that, if anything, showed us exactly what was distinctive about European colonialism, which it wasn't the Sword of Islam. It was a civilizing mission, creating plural, liberal, accountable societies based on capitalism, based on property rights, that would be self-governing and relatively free internally. This was precisely what Mussolini didn't do. And that's then telling us that fascism, as you say, along with communism and Islam, had a very different understanding of what they were supposed to be doing when they expanded into neighboring or overseas territories.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up, fascism. I think that the Nazi movement reminds me very much of the present indigenous movement as well, in that the Nazis clearly admired Islamic expansion. I mean, the Hitler's Table Talk, which was recorded by, there was a reporter basically hanging out at his table taking notes. I think that was authenticated in the 1970s. He talks about, and the Nazi brass talked about the fact that the defeat of the Islamic invaders by Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers was a tragedy, because had Islam conquered Europe, it would have found itself in the sense of being a powerful indigenous force, as opposed to having been Christianized, which they viewed as having been Judaized. Uh, and that they had, they promoted the Hansa brigades in their conquest intent to conquer Russia, and basically spread a sort of a pre-Christian ethos across Europe, as they admired the ancient Nordic approach, and they had all these crackpot theories about the Aryan Superman and all this kind of stuff, which is really not the norm of European civilization, but which served their purpose as well. But I equate it with today's so-called indigenous movement, because the entire Nazi enterprise was based on this idea of repatriating indigenous Germans. That's why they did the Anschluss in Austria. That's why they demanded the Sudetenland from the Czechs, because that was German. It was German speaking, and they were ancient peoples. And eventually, it's why they invaded Poland, because of the Germans who lived in the corridor and in East Prussia were being, ruled by a foreign force, and that they had to come back to the real motherland, or the fatherland in their case, and in order to move toward this great racial or indigenous society and civilization that was superior, in the sense that it would rule other less superior races and civilizations. So, today's indigenous movement has the same idea. It's based on
Yeah,
race.
yeah. It's I mean, you just have to see how Native American land claims and territorial claims keep expanding and expanding well beyond initial treaty areas, in a way that very much echoes kind of Lebensraum and Anschluss. I mean,
Yeah, totally.
every there's a waterfall that goes through downtown. Well, the river that goes through Portland is called the Willamette River, and just upstream of Portland is a place called Multnomah Falls. Willamette Falls, and
Mm-hmm.
Willamette Falls was a big industrial area at the turn of the century. It's got a big there was a pulp and paper mill. There was all kinds of mills. It's a complete industrial relic right now, and they've been trying for years to redevelop it. And suddenly, in step the local native tribes and say, "Oh, this was a sacred waterfall for us, actually, because we've just heard from our knowledge keepers that we used to come and do spiritual exercises here, and yoga and whatever, basket weaving and fishing, and suddenly the tribes have a veto over the entire development project." And you see this again and again. And the other thing is, you notice is these, especially in New England, the ceremonial stone landscapes, the Indian rocks, the sacred Indian rocks formations, which are basically just rubble left over from white farmers, but now the Indians have suddenly remembered that no, these were placed by our ancestors. And so whole tracts of land and whatnot are being suddenly claimed by the indigenous peoples as part of their traditional homelands, or having sacred significance. And absolutely, what is this other than Anschluss and Lebensraum for the native peoples?
And they were glorifying the ancient runes and the occult of the Nordic mythological pantheon. I mean, this is the return to Valhalla. It's against and at the end of the day, it's anti-Christian, certainly anti-Jewish, but it's anti-Western, and that's the motivation. That's why the left is embracing this movement now. That's why it's become trendy. It's
Well,
saying that
it's illiberal, basically. It's basically trying to remove the fundamental principle of a liberal society, which is equality of status, which is nobody has a status in the system that is anything other than equal. Now, you can go ahead and do your best and end up with a lot more than the next guy. As long as you started out with an equal status, then that's what defines a liberal
that's right.
civilization. The moment you have a hierarchy hierarchy of races or ethnicities, you've
Mm.
given up on the fundamental liberal principle.
And that's the fundamental idea of the basically the operating political philosophy of the United States. I mean, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, which derives from the book of Genesis, where it says that God created men and women, and it does say women, in his image. And that's where this idea derives. Don't have different status. When, we're born equal, we die equal. We may have different achievements, but under the law, we are equal, and that we don't get. I mean, one of the other items in the Declaration is that we avoid and we forbid the assumption of titles. I mean, what is this if not that? I mean, you're not entitled to any kind of a benefit by virtue of your birth. And haven't we done so much in our society to get rid of those darker tendencies of human nature, like getting rid of chattel slavery, empowering and enfranchising more people,
Yeah. And
women's rights to vote, all of these
what is
things.
the reparations movement is an attempt to reestablish titles. It's to say I can, and so is the indigenous movement, by the way, too. Is about I can claim some blood quantum, and it's of course funny now to hear the blacks and the indigenous demanding blood quantum measurements. But if I can claim a blood quantum of indigeneity, or if I can claim a some lineage to a slave, I am going to have special status. I'm going to have a special title in this polity.
And it's a reemergence of the very thing that this country has struggled hard to get rid of. And it's, again, one of these darker sides of human nature, which is that you're judged. I mean, people would judge by if they had black ancestry, not so much in this country. I think that was more in the British colonies, but that would have been seen as a strike against you. We were supposed to be moving away from that. The
Well,
other thing is
and the
that there is.
Catholic emancipation as well didn't happen until the 1830s. So
That's right.
Catholics were born as subhumans in every Western country until the early to mid 19th century.
Right, and there was an attempt to reinforce, not to change the subject here, but there was an attempt to reinforce that idea and scientize it by Darwin. Not to get into a big one, but in his book Descent of Man, he says that the Irish are actually less evolved than the English, and that the Aborigine people of Australia are closer to the ape than they are to the human being. So, these scientized ideas of the nature of humanity contradict the biblical idea, which is that we're all born, we're all equal, we're all images of God. But yet, this is they're reviving this in a way that I think benefits the left. I think that it comes from, in more recent, the philosophy of sociologist Frantz Fanon, who was the author of the book The Wretched of the Earth, who basically viewed the Marxist dialectic of class as having failed because the lower classes weren't interested. They were more interested in picking themselves up and gaining property. So he switched it over to focus on race and on geography as the new dialectic, and that's what they're promoting now. But ironically, they will tell if you take a look at this thing as it exists now in politics, what they're saying is that if there's a virtue in the indigenous status of someone, then therefore would you not be opposed to the immigrant status of someone? After all, I will proudly state for the record right now that I am a descendant of immigrants who came to this country around the turn of the last century. Does that make me somehow less of a person, a citizen of the Americas? I mean, because of that. I mean, and what about all of the immigrants who are crossing the open border that constitutes the southern United States right now? Are they indigenous or are they immigrants? It's interesting that the left is big supporters of open borders to allow immigrants to come into the United States, but yet they are supporters of indigenous rights.
Yeah, and I think there's something bigger going on with borders again, and think of this contrast. So on the one hand, you're saying you don't like colonialism because it violates borders and violates sovereignty. So suddenly you're all about borders and sovereignty, right? And on the other hand, when the borders and sovereignty aren't working for you, you're suddenly a advocate of globalism and open borders and global governance, right? But isn't global governance just colonialism? And isn't open borders just an example of stealing land and violating self-governance? I mean, you're right that the contradictions are endless. The main issue, of course, when you get right down to it, is the ageless human challenge of accepting the principle of liberal equality. Because the problem with liberal equality is it's substantively empty. And human beings, I mean, and this was basically Francis Fukuyama's point in the end of history, is, which is totally misunderstood as a book, by the way, by people who've never read it. And Fukuyama thought that liberal equality as a principle was not going to be very durable, because even though it generates more technological and economic well-being, even though it solves political conflicts, even though it resonates with a basic human instinct of treating each other equally, it doesn't satisfy those deep, what he called those thymotic desires to dominate others. And Fukuyama believed in that book that liberal democracy was not going to last. That's why it was called The Last Man, right? The last man would be the last liberal man standing, because it's not enough. And I do think that this indigeneity movement, the BLM movement, the decolonized movement, all of these movements of identity assertion on the left are basically Fukuyama coming to life. They're the proof of his book that said liberal equality as a principle doesn't satisfy those deep needs to show that we are superior to our fellow human beings, because being equal to our fellow human beings just doesn't satisfy the deep human desire to dominate and be seen as superior. And that's basically the story of modern political history, is political movements which have been based on the assertion of superiority and domination of one type of man over another. And I don't see the easy fix for that, because you can rally around, belief in liberal equality and the belief in constitutionalism and freedoms and whatnot. But remember, those are all procedural. They don't give us a substantive answer to the big questions and desires in life. And once you've given up on God in particular, you're left scrounging for a political movement, climate change, indigeneity, Black Lives Matter, that will somehow satisfy that thymotic desire to dominate others.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, to paraphrase G.K. Chesterton, he talked about that if you give up belief in God, of a creator of the universe, then you're going to believe in anything, because you're going to believe in Hitler, or you're going to believe in whoever is presented as the man God. I mean, this is what the Bible warns us about in their in the railing against idol worship. The false gods, the man-made gods that can't exist unless they're manipulated by the imperfect hand of man. So yeah.
The other thing I'd say, so you say Israel's been in the news a lot. It has, and this issue of colonialism has come up. And so I have a slightly different view of this, which is, so of course, it's obvious that the Jewish people originated in the Levant, and we have the Second Temple building. We have ample archaeological evidence to know that that's where the Jews originated. Nonetheless, the Jews mainly left, and Jewish population mainly was outside of contemporary Middle East for the longest time. I mean, I think proportionally it still is, but there wasn't a Jewish state after the sacking of the Second Temple. You have to go way back to find that.
Right.
Modern Israel, whatever antecedents there are in terms of Jewish history in that region, modern Israel is a colonial creation. And instead of sidestepping that fact, we should accept it and embrace it.
Indeed.
Because had the British not I mean, had the British not had their foothold in Egypt and the Sudan in the late 19th century, and therefore being the force that took on the Ottoman Empire and the Germans in the Middle East during World War One, the British would not have been given that mandate over Palestine, because they were on the spot. I mean, Allenby marched into Jerusalem because the British colonial governing system was on the spot and created the colonial mandate. And without the colonial mandate run by Britain, there would never have been an Israel, because the Zionists and the Jews in London were squabbling and dickering and doddering and debating. Right. There's no way that the Jews, the Jewish diaspora, could have marched into Palestine unaided and created modern Israel. It happened because of the British colonial state. And that's something to be thankful for, that this is a successor to a colonial state, because that's what makes Israel successful. So when people say, oh, Israel's not a settler colonial state, I say, no, it is. Like, let's just be honest. It is a settler state in the sense of it has been settled or resettled, if you want, by Jews. And it's a colonial state. It comes right out of the British colonial formation there. There's just there's no historical break between the British mandate in Palestine and Israel.
You're absolutely right. And I think that, there are a lot of people that don't want to acknowledge that, but that is a virtue. And, Israel can reach the olive branch of peace to their fellow colonial Arab states. Right. Except it's a different type of colonialism, but nevertheless, they're Arab states because they were colonized by Arabia. Right. So, you have this interesting balance, but yet the same people who have been out marching and the Black Lives Matter crowd and Antifa that were burning black businesses and looting black neighborhoods, and after the George Floyd death, are now agitating against the existence of Israel. So it seems to be just the same motley crew of people. You've seen them in Portland, I've seen them here in Boston, and it's literally the same people who are just getting all this attention, and they seem to wield a great deal of influence over the government.
Yeah, and I think it's because we've allowed this word colonialism to become a bad word, and colonial state or colonial created state. But if that is a delegitimating point, then every single country in Africa is illegitimate.
Well, every single person in the United States, other than Native Americans, is illegitimate. And the idiocy of this ultimately is going to be the cause to have it implode on itself, in the same way that the idiocy of communism imploded in Russia. The idea is that the same people who are there with their ashen faces and they're screaming at Israel, they're descended from people who were immigrants to the United States, with a few minor exceptions. What are they going to do? Are they going to go back to somewhere else? I mean, the whole thing is absolutely absurd on its face, especially in America. Are they occupying by living in Cambridge? Right? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, so you just need to look north of the border to see what this looks like. So all self-respecting Canadian academics now identify themselves as settler colonialists. So they take it on like a badge of honor that they are so guilty about being settler colonialists. And typically their bylines will say settler colonialist living on the stolen land of the so-and-so peoples under the unceded territory is the term they use. Unceded territory, i.e. it was all Native American, and we just, we stay here, but they didn't really cede it to us because, we shouldn't have been here. And so their whole persona is this sort of this penitent persona, and says, well, I'm just working hard every day to undo the harms of settler colonialism, and I myself am a settler colonialist. Look, it's right in byline, right beside my pronouns.
Fine, they are settler colonialists. Great.
Well, they are settler colonialists. That's right.
I mean,
but if you don't like being a settler colonialist, then leave, go back to Europe.
yeah. And by the way, which native tribe would they be giving their land back to tomorrow? I mean, it's
Right.
again, we
Right.
talked about how these tribes were in a state of war. They didn't have any particularly developed concept of property either way. They were nomadic. They tended to be, at least in North America, they didn't build any cities, and they were slashing and burning as a way of hunting for prey. And it wasn't exactly good for the environment. And they have this idealistic, romanticized vision, very similar to the way the Nazis viewed the pre-Christian Germans, the Aryans, as being a pure people who were not corrupted by Western values.
Yeah.
So that kind of, I think that describes the movement that we're looking at. So Bruce, talk a little bit about your book, how it's been received, where people can get it, if you have a website you'd like to share.
So the book is called The Case for Colonialism. It's actually my third book on colonialism, because I got into this project with an article called The Case for Colonialism back in 2017. That's where I got the kind of global outcry, 20,000 people signing petitions. The article retracted because the editors of the journal were getting death threats. That article was written because I was working on a biography which came out with Regnery in 2019 called The Last Imperialist, biography of a British colonial official who I got interested in. I found his personal papers. So that was the beginning.
Who was it? Who was that?
His name is Sir Alan Burns, and he was, he was the governor of the Gold Coast, which became Ghana. And then really his most famous role was he was the UN point person for Britain on colonial affairs right during the decolonization debates of the 50s. And, was just a super interesting seminal figure. I just thought the guy's life was fascinating. So that was the first. Then in the course of that, I got interested in German colonialism. So I wrote a book called In Defense of German Colonialism, which also came out with Regnery. And, with the article and the two books, I was, of course, getting a lot of backlash. People were arguing with me. People were writing long dissertations, attacking my views. So, I started to write in response and take up things. And, typically people will say, well, what about this? Well, what about that? Well, what about this atrocity? Well, what about this case? So I just was spending a lot of time writing long, essays or scholarly pieces, responding to the criticisms. And eventually I realized I had written a book. So I went back, pulled it all together, rewrote it, expanded it, amended parts. And The Case for Colonialism, which just came out last month, essentially brings together my summative views on this question. And, I think importantly, responds to a lot of the criticisms that have been directed at me in a way that at least lays out, my fully considered views on this question. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Publisher is New English Review Press. And my website is at pdx.edu. That's my university, Portland State University. So it's web.pdx.edu/GillyP.
Now, Bruce, just to wrap it up here, you are a political science professor at Portland State University. I mean, Portland was the site of a great deal of violence in the summer of 2020, where the Hatfield Federal Courthouse was pelted with rocks, and it was burned, and there was graffiti all everywhere, in what can only be described as an insurrection, in my opinion. That is, being a federal building that houses the judiciary. How is it that this happens, Bruce? How are you received over there at Portland State?
Well, Oregon is more purple than people realize. That's one thing. Okay. I think it's probably true of Massachusetts and New York too, right? I mean, we all know that there's the ultra liberal city,
but we tend to speak sotto voce, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, but
whereas you're there with a bullhorn.
The ultra liberal city, and then there's the rest of the state, which is mixed or Republican. So
yes, indeed.
Portland itself, I think, yes, experienced horrible summer of love, but 90% of those hooligans and terrorists and insurrectionists were from outside Oregon. They just came in here because our DA made it very clear that he was not going to prosecute anyone. So we ended up being the magnet for the crazies from across the country. But if you look at the rap sheets and the mugshots, they're all from all over the country. It was just a kind of piling into Portland. Now they're all gone. Our downtown is destroyed. Our economy is tanking. People are leaving, but the mobs themselves have subsided.
Well, that's good news. Although the government is still quite liberal, I understand that recently the governor says that, or the Department of Education has said that there's no longer any need for standards, for testing. So we won't know if your graduates can read or write. But
yeah, and the great irony about all this stuff, all this ultra liberalism in Oregon, there's no black people in Oregon. Like there is, it's like less than 2%, closer to 1% of the population, and they're virtually all in Portland. So, but all this kind of George Floyd moral panic in Oregon and in the Department of Education, the governor's office, for a population that barely exists here. It just shows how completely disengaged and disconnected it is from the realities of the everyday needs of the people of Oregon, that they've essentially seized the government for this movement over a population that basically doesn't exist here.
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's one of these top-down sort of agendas. Anyways, Bruce Gilley, listen, I really appreciate your time today. Really interesting talk. Great book. It's been an honor to talk to you. And thanks so much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
All right. Take care.